So, as you settle deeper into your dreams, imagine the sickbeds of the 17th century, where the flickering candlelight illuminated not just suffering, but also strange, desperate attempts at healing, from raging fevers to persistent skin ailments, and even the murky depths of mental affliction. The humble louse found its place in the peculiar pharmacopoeia of the era. It was a testament to a medical understanding, vastly different from our own, where the line between pest and panacea was drawn in the most unexpected of places, and where hope, however misplaced, could be found in the most unlikely of companions. Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a time machine. But fair warning, this isn't one of those sparkling, sanitized versions of the past you see in period dramas. Oh no. Tonight, we're going deep into the 17th century, a world where the air hangs heavy with a symphony of smells you'd probably pay good money not to experience today. Think less fragrant lavender fields and more... well, let's just say personal hygiene wasn't exactly at the top of the charts, and the concept of a daily shower was as fantastical as a flying carriage. You're about to discover a world so alien to our modern sensibilities that, honestly, you probably wouldn't survive a week without a serious case of the vapors, or worse, a genuine illness that would make you wish for a time machine back to your germ-free present. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Having explored the specific applications of lice in 17th century medicine, let's expand our view to the broader landscape of peculiar treatments that coexisted with, and sometimes overshadowed, the use of these tiny insects. You're now in a bustling apothecary shop, or perhaps a physician's private laboratory, filled with an array of strange ingredients and even stranger tools. The air is thick with the scent of dried herbs, but also something more unsettling, the faint, metallic tang of blood, the musky odor of animal parts, and the cloying sweetness of various concoctions. This was a time when the human body was seen as a complex, often mysterious, machine, and the remedies for its ills were as varied and imaginative as they were often ineffective, or even harmful. You find yourself standing on a cobbled street, the air thick and pungent. It's a tapestry of scents, really the acrid tang of wood smoke from countless hearths, mingling with the earthy dampness of unpaved alleys. There's the unmistakable, cloying sweetness of human waste overflowing from rudimentary privies, often just pits in the ground or buckets emptied directly into the street. Intertwined with this is the musky aroma of unwashed bodies, a scent that clings to wool and linen, a constant companion in an era where bathing was a rare, often seasonal affair. You can almost taste the dust and grime on your tongue, a fine particulate layer that settles on everything, from the rough-hewn timbers of the houses to the very clothes on your back. Imagine the sheer variety of substances on display. A common historical fact is the use of mummy powder, or mumia. This wasn't just a quirky, one-off remedy, it was a highly prized and expensive ingredient, believed to possess powerful healing properties due to its supposed connection to ancient Egyptian embalming practices. You'd find it prescribed for everything from bruises and internal bleeding to epilepsy and plague. The idea was that the life force or essence of the deceased, preserved in the mummy, could be transferred to the living patient. It's like believing that eating a famous athlete's old running shoes would make you a faster runner. The logic is tenuous, to say the least. But the desire for a miracle cure was strong. Imagine the sheer sensory overload. Your nose, accustomed to the crisp, often artificially scented air of the 21st century, is assaulted by this cacophony of odors. You wrinkle it instinctively, but there's no escaping it. This is the baseline, the everyday reality. The concept of fresh is entirely different here. A fresh breeze might simply mean the wind has shifted, carrying the stench of the tannery downriver instead of the butcher's offal from up the street. It's a world where personal space is a luxury, and the closeness of bodies, often unwashed for weeks or even months, means you're constantly inhaling the exhalations and emanations of your fellow citizens. Then there were the mineral remedies. Precious stones, like sapphires or emeralds, were often ground into fine powders and mixed with liquids, believed to impart their inherent virtues to the patient. For example, powdered pearls were thought to strengthen the heart and purify the blood. while crushed coral was used for various internal ailments. The belief wasn't in their chemical composition, but in their intrinsic magical or sympathetic properties. You might be told to swallow a tiny bit of powdered diamond for courage, or a sprinkle of ruby for vitality. It's a bit like believing your lucky charm will cure your cold. This isn't to say people didn't try to smell better. Oh, they did. But their methods were often creative. You'd see ladies and gentlemen, particularly among the wealthier classes, carrying pomanders, small perforated balls filled with fragrant herbs, spices, or ambergris. They'd hold them to their noses, a tiny fragrant shield against the olfactory onslaught. But it was a losing battle, a thin veil over a pervasive reality. The rich might have access to more frequent changes of linen, but even their clothes, washed in harsh lye soaps and dried in the same dusty, smoky air, retained a certain character. Animal products, beyond the humble louse, formed a significant part of the pharmacopoeia. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen, animal excrement, urine, and various organs were frequently used? For instance, dried wolf's liver was sometimes prescribed for liver ailments. Based on the principle of like cures like, the fat of a bear might be used for rheumatism, or the blood of a goat for certain fevers. It was a vast and often gruesome menagerie of remedies, driven by a desperate search for anything that might work. The prevailing medical wisdom of the time, rooted in ancient Greek and Roman theories, didn't connect these pervasive odors or the lack of hygiene directly to disease in the way we understand germ theory today. Instead, they subscribed to the idea of miasmas, noxious air, bad smells, believed to carry disease. So, while they might try to mask the smells, they weren't necessarily trying to eliminate the source of the smells for health reasons. It was more about making life tolerable, about maintaining a semblance of civility in a world that was, by modern standards, incredibly filthy. It's like trying to put a tiny air freshener in a dumpster fire. Admirable effort, but ultimately futile. Now, for a unique and lesser-known detail, did you know that unicorn horn was a highly sought-after and incredibly expensive medical ingredient in the 17th century? Of course, actual unicorn horns didn't exist. What was being sold and used was typically narwhal tusk, ground into a powder. It was believed to be a powerful antidote to poisons, a cure for fevers, and a general panacea. The sheer cost and rarity of it only added to its perceived potency. Imagine paying a fortune for powdered narwhal tusk, believing it would save you from the plague. It's a stark reminder of the power of belief and the lengths people would go to for hope. Consider the common historical fact that public sanitation systems were virtually non-existent in most European cities during the 17th century. Waste, both human and animal, was routinely dumped into rivers, ditches, or directly onto the streets. This created breeding grounds for disease, but the connection wasn't fully understood. People simply accepted the omnipresent filth as a fact of life, much like we accept traffic jams or annoying pop-up ads today. It was just there. This leads us to a point of academic debate. Historians still debate the extent to which physicians genuinely believed in the efficacy of some of these more outlandish remedies versus prescribing them out of tradition. Pressure from patients, or simply a lack of better alternatives? Was it sincere conviction, or a pragmatic response to the limitations of their knowledge? The motivations were likely complex and varied, and this acceptance of filth extended to the body itself. Bathing was not a regular practice for most people. For the poor, it was a practical impossibility due to lack of facilities, clean water, and fuel to heat it. For the wealthy, it was often seen as unhealthy, believed to open the pores and make one susceptible to illness. Instead, they would dry clean themselves, rubbing down with linen cloths, perhaps dabbing on some rosewater or other scented liquids. Hair was rarely washed, leading to a host of other issues we'll get to later. It's enough to make you itch just thinking about it, isn't it? Consider the role of sympathetic magic in many of these treatments. The idea that things that looked alike, or had a similar origin, could influence each other. For example, a plant with heart-shaped leaves might be used for heart conditions. This was a common historical fact, a pervasive way of thinking that permeated both folk medicine and more formal medical practices. It wasn't about understanding biological mechanisms. It was about perceived connections and correspondences. Now, for a unique and lesser-known detail, did you know that some people in the 17th century actually believed that a certain amount of dirt and grime on the body was beneficial? There was a concept, particularly among some medical practitioners, that the body produced its own protective layer, a kind of natural barrier, and that excessive washing would strip this away, leaving one vulnerable. It wasn't a widespread, universally accepted belief, but it certainly contributed to the general laxity in personal hygiene. Imagine your doctor telling you to skip the shower for a month for your health. It makes you wonder what kind of glow they were aiming for. The psychological impact of these bizarre remedies cannot be overstated. In a world where illness was often a death sentence, and where scientific understanding was rudimentary, the act of doing something, no matter how strange, offered a sense of control and hope. The elaborate rituals, the exotic ingredients, the sheer effort involved in preparing some of these concoctions, all contributed to a powerful placebo effect. If you truly believed that powdered mummy or unicorn horn would cure you, that belief itself could sometimes alleviate symptoms or provide comfort. It's like believing that wearing your lucky socks will help you win the lottery. It might not actually work, but it gives you a sense of agency. This general lack of understanding about hygiene and disease created a fertile ground for all sorts of unusual medical theories and practices. When you don't know about bacteria or viruses, when you can't see the tiny culprits causing illness, you turn to what you can see, what you can smell, what you can touch. You look for patterns, for connections, however tenuous they might seem to us now. And in a world where everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the highest noble, carried a menagerie of microscopic and not so microscopic life on their bodies and in their homes, it was only a matter of time before these ubiquitous companions became part of the medical narrative. The contrast with our modern medical cabinet is striking. Today, we rely on rigorously tested pharmaceuticals, surgical procedures, and a deep understanding of cellular biology. In the 17th century, it was a chaotic mix of ancient theories, empirical observation often misinterpreted, superstition, and desperate experimentation. The barber surgeon might be pulling teeth one moment and performing a rudimentary amputation the next, often with no anesthesia and little understanding of infection. It was a brutal, often terrifying world for the sick. The air you breathe, the clothes you wear, the bed you sleep in, everything is permeated with this 17th century reality. Your skin feels a little sticky, your hair a little greasy. You try to suppress a shiver of disgust, but it's hard. This is the environment in which people lived, loved, worked, and crucially for our story tonight, got sick and sought cures. The very fabric of daily life was woven with elements that we would consider utterly unhygienic, yet they were simply the norm. So, as you drift further into your peaceful slumber, remember the vast and often unsettling cabinet of curiosities that constituted 17th century medicine. From the powdered remains of pharaohs to the mythical horn of a unicorn, from the mundane to the truly grotesque, people sought relief and healing in the most extraordinary of ways. The use of lice in this context was just one small, albeit particularly itchy, piece of a much larger, stranger puzzle. It highlights the incredible journey humanity has taken in its quest to understand and conquer disease, a journey that makes our modern medical advancements seem nothing short of miraculous. And this brings us to a fascinating point of academic debate. Historians still debate whether the prevailing medical theories caused the poor hygiene, or if the poor hygiene influenced the medical theories. Was it a top-down decree that washing was bad, leading to less washing? Or was it simply that washing was difficult and expensive, and so theories evolved to justify the status quo? It's a chicken and egg scenario, a complex interplay of practicalities, beliefs, and the slow, arduous march of scientific understanding. Regardless, the outcome was a society where cleanliness, as we know it, was a foreign concept, and the human body was a host to a multitude of tiny creatures. Now, let's pivot from the strange remedies themselves to the very human process of observation that led to such peculiar conclusions. You're standing, perhaps, in a crowded public square or a bustling marketplace. People are everywhere, living their lives. And illness is a constant, visible presence, without microscopes, without germ theory, without sophisticated diagnostic tools. How did people in the 17th century arrive at the idea that lice could be a cure? The answer lies in their interpretation of what they could see and how they connected those observations to their existing medical framework. So, as you settle deeper into your comfortable chair, perhaps taking a deep, clean breath of your own home's air, remember the sensory world we've just explored? This is the stage upon which our story unfolds, a world where the lines between pest and potential panacea were blurred, where desperation often trumped logic, and where the most unlikely of remedies found their place in the medical cabinet. It's a world that will make you appreciate your hand sanitizer and your daily shower more than ever before. Imagine a common historical fact: the high mortality rates of the 17th century. Life was precarious, and death, particularly from disease, was a frequent visitor. When someone fell ill, especially with a severe fever or a wasting sickness, their body would undergo visible changes. Their skin might become clammy, their temperature fluctuate, and their overall vitality would diminish. And it was in observing these changes that a crucial, yet ultimately misleading pattern emerged. Now, let's peel back another layer of the 17th century, moving from the sensory world to the intellectual landscape that governed health and illness. You're standing in a physician's study, perhaps, or a barber surgeon's cramped shop. The air here might be slightly cleaner, perhaps tinged with the scent of dried herbs or the metallic tang of instruments. But the ideas floating within it are just as foreign to your modern mind as the street smells we just left behind. This is a world where medicine wasn't about microscopic invaders or complex chemical reactions, but about balance, a delicate, precarious balance of what were known as the four humors. You see a sick person, perhaps a child, lying in bed. They are weak, feverish, and their body is struggling. Over the course of their illness, you notice something: the lice that were once abundant on their scalp and clothing begin to disappear. They either die off or they abandon the host, seeking a more hospitable environment. To our modern minds, this is easily explained. The patient's body temperature might drop, or their skin might become less appealing due to dehydration or changes in body chemistry, making it unsuitable for the lice. The lice are simply reacting to a dying host. Imagine a grand cosmic clockwork, where every aspect of your being, from your personality to your physical health, is dictated by the precise proportions of four fundamental fluids within your body blood: phlegm, yellow bile or choler, and black bile or melancholy. This isn't just some quaint historical footnote. This was the bedrock of medical understanding for nearly 2 millennia, stretching all the way back to ancient Greece, primarily through the writings of Hippocrates and later Galen. So, when you felt unwell, it wasn't a virus attacking your cells. It was an imbalance in these humors. Too much blood, too little phlegm, an excess of yellow bile. Each imbalance manifested as a specific illness with its own set of symptoms. But to a 17th century observer, lacking our scientific understanding, this observation would be interpreted very differently. If the lice were seen as a sign of vitality, as we discussed in Part 3, then their departure would be a grave omen. It would suggest that the patient's life force was waning, that their humors were so out of balance that even the hardy lice could no longer thrive. It's like watching the canaries in a coal mine die, and thinking the canaries themselves are the cause of the problem, rather than the toxic gases. You can almost visualize it: a doctor, with a serious expression and perhaps a slightly stained apron, pondering your condition not by listening to your heart or taking your temperature, but by observing your complexion, the quality of your pulse, the color of your urine, and even your temperament. Are you hot and flushed? Perhaps an excess of blood? Are you lethargic and pale? Too much phlegm? Are you irritable and prone to anger? Yellow bile is likely running high, and if you're melancholic and withdrawn, well, that's black bile for you. It's a surprisingly holistic approach. In a way, connecting the physical with the emotional and even the environmental. This misinterpretation of observation is a unique and lesser-known detail of how these beliefs formed. They weren't necessarily inventing the idea of lice as a cure out of thin air. Instead, they were taking a real, observable phenomenon, the disappearance of lice on the severely ill, and fitting it into their existing humoral framework. If the lice leaving meant the patient was getting worse, then perhaps the presence of lice, or even encouraging their presence, could help ward off that decline, or even draw out the illness. It was a desperate attempt to reverse a perceived negative trend, to bring back the sign of health. But it wasn't just blood. If you had too much phlegm, you might be given emetics to induce vomiting or purgatives to cause diarrhea, literally expelling the offending humor from your body. If yellow bile was the culprit, bitter herbs or even leeches might be employed. And for black bile, well, that was often the trickiest, leading to treatments for melancholy that ranged from dietary changes to more esoteric concoctions. It was a constant battle to maintain equilibrium, a medical tightrope walk where the slightest deviation could send you tumbling into illness. This leads us to a point of academic debate. Historians still debate the extent to which these interpretations were conscious. Deliberate medical theories versus emergent folk beliefs, born from repeated, albeit misinterpreted, observations. Was there a formal Lausometer for health? Or was it more of a general intuitive understanding? The evidence suggests a blend of both, with folk wisdom often influencing formal medical thought in an era before rigorous scientific methodology. Think about the implications of the system. If your illness was caused by an internal imbalance, then external factors like hygiene, or what we now know as germs, were largely irrelevant in the primary cause of disease. They might be seen as contributing factors, perhaps, or as indicators of a humoral imbalance, but not as the direct agents of sickness. This fundamental misunderstanding shaped everything, from public health policy or lack thereof, to individual medical practices. It's like trying to fix a computer virus by adjusting the brightness of the screen. You're addressing a symptom, not the root cause. Consider the power of anecdotal evidence. If a patient was very ill and their lice disappeared, and then, by some chance, they recovered perhaps due to their own immune system, or another genuinely effective remedy, the observation of the lice's departure might be seen as a turning point. And if, in another case, a patient with lice didn't get worse, or even seem to improve, it would reinforce the idea that the lice were somehow beneficial. These isolated instances, without controlled studies or a grasp of statistical significance, could easily lead to flawed conclusions. It's like seeing a few people win the lottery and concluding that buying a ticket guarantees wealth. Now, for a unique and lesser-known detail about humoral theory, did you know that the humors were also believed to be influenced by the stars and planets? Astrological medicine was a significant component of 17th century medical practice. Physicians would consult almanacs and astrological charts to determine the most auspicious time for treatments, like bloodletting or administering herbs. The alignment of celestial bodies was thought to affect the balance of humors in the body, making a patient more susceptible to certain illnesses or more responsive to particular remedies. So your doctor wasn't just a physician. They were also an amateur astronomer, trying to decipher the cosmic influences on your spleen. It adds a whole new layer of complexity, doesn't it? Imagine your modern doctor checking your horoscope before prescribing antibiotics. The lack of understanding of microbiology meant that they couldn't see the true culprits of disease. They couldn't see the bacteria causing the fever, or the viruses spreading the plague. So they looked for visible, tangible signs. The lice were visible, their presence, or absence, was observable. And in a world desperate for answers, these visible patterns became the basis for their medical theories, however misguided. The common phrase you'd hear, often from the mouth of a learned physician, would be something like, "The humors are in disarray," or "a plethora of blood afflicts him." These weren't just casual observations, they were precise diagnoses within their medical framework. And the treatments followed directly from these diagnoses. If you were feverish, you were hot and wet, too much blood and phlegm. And the cure would involve cooling and drying agents, alongside the inevitable bloodletting. If you were suffering from a persistent cough, it might be an excess of cold, damp phlegm, requiring warming and drying remedies. Think about the psychological comfort this provided. In a time of immense uncertainty and fear surrounding illness, having a visible indicator, even one as strange as lice, offered a sense of understanding and control. "Oh, the lice are leaving, he's getting worse." Or, "The lice are still here, there's still hope." It gave them something concrete to latch onto, a tangible sign in a world of invisible threats. The sheer variety of substances used in these treatments is mind-boggling. You'd find physicians prescribing everything from common herbs like chamomile and lavender to more exotic imports like opium and cinchona bark, which, coincidentally, contained quinine, a genuinely effective treatment for malaria, though they didn't understand why it worked. Then there were the truly bizarre ingredients: powdered mummified remains, ground up precious stones, animal excrement. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? It's a recurring theme, and even human bodily fluids. It was a veritable witch's brew of remedies, all aimed at nudging those elusive humors back into their proper alignment. This reliance on direct observation, without the benefit of scientific instruments or the germ theory revolution, is a common historical fact across many ancient and pre-modern medical systems. From examining urine and feces to observing skin lesions and changes in breath, physicians and healers relied heavily on their senses to diagnose and prognose. The louse, in this context, was just another piece of the observational puzzle, albeit one that led them down a very itchy, very wrong path. And this leads us to a point of academic debate. Historians still debate whether the continued adherence to humoral theory, despite its obvious flaws, was primarily due to a lack of alternative scientific models, or if it was deeply entrenched in social and religious beliefs, making it resistant to change. Was it simply the best they had? Or was it a system so interwoven with their worldview that questioning it felt like questioning the very order of the universe? It's a complex question, highlighting the inertia of established paradigms. So, as you drift deeper into your peaceful slumber, imagine the diligent, yet ultimately flawed, observations of the 17th century mind. They were trying to make sense of a world teeming with unseen threats, using the tools and knowledge available to them, and in their earnest attempts to decipher the mysteries of health and illness, they saw patterns in the most unlikely of places, transforming tiny, unwelcome guests into peculiar indicators, and even potential agents of healing. It's a profound reminder of the journey of human knowledge, from the visible and misinterpreted to the invisible and understood. Think about the psychological impact of this medical system on the patient. You're not just sick, your very essence, your internal balance, is out of whack. The treatments, often painful and debilitating, were seen as necessary evils to restore harmony. You might feel worse after a vigorous round of purging or bloodletting, but that was often interpreted as the body expelling the bad humors, a sign that the treatment was working. It has to get worse before it gets better was likely a common refrain, a grim comfort in a time of limited options and profound suffering. Now, let's consider the practical realities of 17th century life that made such unconventional remedies, including the use of lice, not just theoretically plausible, but also incredibly appealing, particularly to the common person. You're stepping out of the physician's study and back into the bustling, often impoverished, daily existence of most people. Here, access to formal medical care was a luxury, and desperation was a constant companion. The physician, in this system, was less a diagnostician of specific diseases and more a skilled balancer of internal fluids. Their reputation rested on their ability to interpret the subtle signs of humoral imbalance and prescribe the correct countermeasures. It was an art as much as a science, relying heavily on observation, experience, and sometimes sheer guesswork. And given the high mortality rates of the time, it was a profession fraught with both immense respect and profound responsibility. Imagine the vast majority of the population farmers, laborers, servants, artisans. For them, a visit to a university-trained physician was often out of reach, a prohibitive expense. These learned doctors, with their Latin texts and complex humoral diagnoses, catered primarily to the wealthy elite. The common historical fact is that most people relied on a patchwork of medical care local barber surgeons for basic procedures like tooth extraction or bloodletting, apothecaries for herbal remedies and concoctions, and, perhaps most importantly, the wisdom of their own communities. The village elder, the wise woman, or simply experienced family members. The concept of disease itself was different. It wasn't a distinct entity that invaded the body, but a state of being, a deviation from the natural, healthy balance. This meant that prevention was also focused on maintaining humoral equilibrium. Diet, exercise, sleep, and even emotional states were all considered crucial for health, as they could all influence the balance of humors. So, while they didn't have germ theory, they did have a sophisticated, albeit flawed, understanding of lifestyle's impact on well-being. It's a bit like modern wellness trends. but with a much stranger underlying philosophy. In this context, the accessibility of a remedy was paramount. You couldn't afford exotic ingredients imported from distant lands, nor could you always pay for the services of a skilled practitioner. What you did have, in abundance, were the very creatures we've been discussing. Lice were everywhere. They were on your body, on your children, in your bedding, and in your clothes. They required no special preparation, no expensive tools, and no formal training to administer. They were, quite literally, a free and readily available resource. It's like trying to fix a broken pipe with duct tape when you can't afford a plumber. It might not be the ideal solution, but it's what you have on hand. So, as you drift further into the past, leaving behind the bustling, odorous streets and stepping into the hushed, often unsettling world of 17th century medicine, you begin to grasp the intellectual framework that shaped their understanding of the human body. The four humors, a concept as ancient as it was enduring, dictated everything from diagnosis to treatment, from the barber surgeon's lancet to the herbalist's concoctions. It was a system that, while fundamentally incorrect by modern standards, provided a coherent, if ultimately limited, explanation for the mysteries of illness and health. And it's within this very framework, this belief in internal balance and external expulsion, that we'll soon discover the surprising role of some very small, very common, and very unwelcome guests. This economic reality made the idea of lice as a cure particularly appealing to the poor. If a child was suffering from a fever, and the parents couldn't afford a physician, the idea that simply allowing the lice to remain, or even encouraging them, could help draw out the illness offered a sense of agency and hope. It was a low-cost, low-effort intervention that aligned with some of the prevailing medical theories, however flawed. It's a grim kind of DIY medicine, born from necessity rather than choice. Now, let's shift our focus from the grand theories of humors to the more intimate, and perhaps more unsettling, realities of 17th century life. You're back in the everyday world, perhaps sitting by a hearth in a modest home, or even in a grand manor. The air, as we've established, is far from fresh, and the concept of personal hygiene is, shall we say, fluid. This environment, combined with the lack of understanding about microscopic life, created the perfect breeding ground for creatures that, to our modern sensibilities, are nothing short of a nightmare lice. Now, for a unique and lesser-known detail about this common man's cure sometimes, people would even transfer lice from a healthy person or an animal, in some folk practices to a sick person, specifically to encourage the extraction process. This wasn't just about letting them be. It was an active attempt to introduce the healing agents to the afflicted. Imagine the scene: a mother carefully collecting lice from her own head, or perhaps from a family pet, to place them on her feverish child. It's a truly unsettling image, but one that speaks volumes about the desperation and the depth of belief in these unconventional remedies. Imagine the constant, subtle itch. It's not just an occasional scratch, it's a persistent, maddening sensation. A tiny army of uninvited guests making themselves at home on your scalp, in your clothing, and even on your body. Head lice, body lice, pubic lice. They were simply a fact of life for virtually everyone, regardless of social standing. From the king to the commoner, from the pampered lady to the hard-working peasant, these tiny, blood-sucking insects were ubiquitous. They crawled, they bit, they laid their eggs nits in your hair and on your clothing fibers. It was a universal experience, a shared burden that transcended class and wealth. This leads us to a point of academic debate. Historians still debate the ethical implications of these practices from a modern perspective. While we understand the context of limited knowledge and desperate circumstances, the idea of intentionally introducing parasites for medical purposes raises significant questions about patient welfare in the past. Was it a compassionate act or an unwitting harm? The answer likely lies in the complex interplay of their beliefs and their intentions. You might try to comb them out with fine-toothed combs made of bone or ivory, a common historical fact. These knit combs were a daily ritual for many, a futile attempt to manage an infestation that was, for all intents and purposes, unmanageable without modern sanitation and insecticides. You'd spend hours, or have a servant spend hours, meticulously picking through hair, crushing the tiny bodies between fingernails and scraping away the stubborn nits. But it was a Sisyphean task. As soon as you cleared one area, another would become reinfested. It's like trying to bail out a leaky boat with a teacup. You're making an effort, but the water just keeps coming. The social acceptance of lice also played a crucial role. As we discussed earlier, lice were so common that their presence didn't carry the same stigma as it does today. While they were an annoyance, they weren't necessarily a sign of extreme poverty or moral failing. This meant that using them as a remedy, however strange, wasn't something that would necessarily bring shame or ostracism. It was simply another one of the many unpleasant realities of 17th century life. The constant itching and the visible presence of lice were, of course, annoying. But in the 17th century, they weren't necessarily seen as a sign of extreme ill health or moral failing, as they might be today. They were just there. Part of the natural order of things, like flies in summer or mud in winter. People accepted them with a kind of weary resignation, a shrug of the shoulders, because what else could you do? There was no effective way to eradicate them on a large scale. Think about the power of tradition and inherited knowledge. Folk remedies, passed down through generations, often held immense sway, particularly in rural communities where formal medical education was scarce. If your grandmother had used a particular method for a fever, and it seemed to work, or at least, the patient didn't die immediately, then you would likely continue that practice. The cure of lice, whether formally documented or simply whispered from one household to the next, became part of this inherited wisdom. It's like your family's secret recipe for chicken soup. You might not know why it works, but you trust that it does. This widespread acceptance, however, began to take a strange turn in some medical circles. Within the framework of humoral theory, where the body was constantly striving for balance, and where illness was seen as an internal disequilibrium, the presence of these tiny creatures began to be reinterpreted. Instead of being mere pests, some began to view them as something beneficial. Moreover, the psychological effect of doing something for a loved one who is ill is profound. Even if the remedy was ineffective, the act of administering it, of trying to help, provided comfort to both the patient and the caregiver. In a world with high infant mortality and frequent epidemics, any perceived action to combat disease was better than doing nothing. The louse cure offered a tangible, albeit bizarre, way to feel proactive in the face of overwhelming illness. Now, for a unique and lesser-known detail, some physicians and folk healers in the 17th century actually believed that a person who was healthy would naturally have lice. Conversely, if a person who normally had lice suddenly became free of them, it was considered a grave sign, an indication that their health was failing. This was based on the observation that when people became severely ill, especially with fevers or wasting diseases, their body temperature might drop, or their skin might become less hospitable, causing the lice to abandon their host. They saw the departure of lice as a symptom of worsening illness, rather than their presence being a symptom of poor hygiene. It's a classic case of correlation being mistaken for causation, a medical misinterpretation that sounds utterly absurd to us, but made a twisted kind of sense within their limited understanding. It's like thinking that if your car stops making a funny noise, it must mean it's about to break down completely, rather than realizing the funny noise was just a loose screw. So, as you settle deeper into your peaceful slumber, consider the common man's struggle for health in the 17th century. In a world where formal medicine was often out of reach, and where illness was a constant threat, people turned to what was available, what was affordable, and what, within their flawed understanding, seemed to make a strange kind of sense. The humble louse, despised by us, was, for them, a readily accessible, if unsettling, tool in the desperate, daily battle against disease, a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of a people living on the very edge of medical knowledge. This idea that lice were somehow indicative of vitality was a fascinating twist on the usual pest narrative. It suggested that a healthy body provided a good environment for these creatures, a kind of living barometer of one's well-being. So, if you were scratching your head, it might not just be an annoyance, it could be a subtle reassurance that your humors were in good order, that your internal furnace was burning brightly enough to keep your tiny companions warm and fed. Now, as our journey through the 17th century draws towards its close, let's turn our attention to the slow, almost imperceptible shifts in scientific thought that would eventually challenge the very foundations of these ancient medical beliefs. You're standing on the cusp of a new era, a time when curious minds, armed with nascent tools and a growing skepticism, began to question the established order. It wasn't a sudden revolution, but a gradual awakening, a quiet turning of the tide that would eventually sweep away centuries of humoral theory and its peculiar remedies. This leads us to a point of academic debate. Historians still debate the extent to which this belief in healthy lice was genuinely widespread among the general populace versus being a more esoteric theory confined to certain medical texts or folk practices. Was it a common understanding whispered among neighbors, or more academic, albeit flawed? Hypothesis. The evidence is often anecdotal, making it difficult to gauge its true societal penetration. Imagine the intellectual landscape of the early 17th century. The common historical fact is that the scientific method, as we understand it today, was still in its infancy. Knowledge was often derived from ancient texts, philosophical reasoning, and anecdotal observation, rather than systematic experimentation. Physicians were often more philosophers than scientists, debating the nature of humors and their influence on the body. But beneath this established surface, cracks were beginning to appear. So you have a world where everyone has lice, where bathing is rare, and where illness is attributed to internal imbalances. Into this mix comes the observation that when people get really sick, the lice often disappear. What conclusion do you draw if you don't know about germs, or body temperature regulation, or the specific needs of these insects? You might, quite logically within your framework, conclude that the lice are somehow connected to health, perhaps even protecting it. One of the most significant, yet initially overlooked developments was the invention of the microscope. While not immediately leading to germ theory, this tiny revolutionary instrument, perfected by figures like Antony van Leeuwenhoek in the latter half of the 17th century, offered a glimpse into a previously unseen world. Imagine the sheer wonder, and perhaps revulsion, of seeing animalcules, tiny swimming creatures, in a drop of water, or observing the intricate structures of a flea or a louse in unprecedented detail. This was a unique and lesser-known detail that would slowly, over time, begin to chip away at the old beliefs. This wasn't a universal belief, of course. Many people still found lice disgusting and tried to get rid of them. But the idea that they might be beneficial, or at least a sign of health, gained traction in some circles. It was a way to rationalize an unavoidable reality, to turn a nuisance into a peculiar kind of medical indicator. It's a testament to the human mind's ability to find patterns and explanations, even when those explanations are wildly off the mark. The ability to see these microscopic beings didn't immediately translate into an understanding of disease. People didn't suddenly realize that these animalcules were causing illness. The concept of contagion was still largely linked to miasmas, bad air, rather than tiny living organisms. It's like discovering tiny gears inside a clock, but still believing that the clock tells time because of a magical spirit living inside it. The observation was there, but the interpretation was still bound by existing paradigms. The constant companionship of these creatures also meant that people were intimately familiar with their life cycles and habits. They saw the nits clinging to hair, the adult lice scurrying through strands. They knew how easily they spread from person to person, from shared beds to crowded public spaces. This intimate knowledge, combined with the prevailing medical theories, set the stage for the next, even more astonishing belief that these unwelcome guests could actually be part of the cure. However, the microscope did begin to foster a new way of thinking empiricism. It encouraged direct observation and challenged the reliance on ancient authorities. If you could see the intricate anatomy of a louse, you might start to question whether its purpose was truly to extract bad humors or simply to feed. This new emphasis on what could be seen and measured, however crudely, was a crucial step away from purely theoretical or philosophical medicine. Think about it from their perspective. You're sick? You've tried herbs, perhaps bloodletting, maybe even some of that crocodile dung paste, remember that callback? Nothing seems to be working. And then, someone suggests a remedy that involves these tiny creatures that are already so much a part of your life. It might seem desperate, but in a world where medical science was still in its infancy, where superstition and observation often intertwined, What did you have to lose? This leads us to a point of academic debate. Historians still debate the precise tipping point when empirical observation began to consistently outweigh traditional humoral theory in medical practice. Was it the invention of the microscope, the rise of anatomical studies, or the accumulation of countless failed traditional remedies that finally pushed the needle? It was likely a confluence of factors, a slow burn rather than an explosive revelation. The sheer prevalence of lice meant that they were always available, always accessible. You didn't need to travel to exotic lands for rare herbs or pay exorbitant fees for a physician's special concoction. The cure, or at least a component of it, was literally crawling on your head. This accessibility made it a particularly appealing option for the poor, who couldn't afford more expensive treatments. It was a people's medicine, born out of necessity and a flawed understanding of biology, parallel to the microscopic observations. There was a growing interest in anatomy and physiology. Physicians began to dissect human bodies with greater frequency and precision, gaining a more accurate understanding of organs and their functions. This challenged the abstract notion of humors flowing freely and subtly influencing health, replacing it with a more concrete, if still incomplete, understanding of bodily systems. The body was no longer just a vessel for humors. It was a complex machine with discernible parts. So, as the flickering candlelight casts long shadows across the room, and you feel that phantom itch on your scalp, you begin to understand how these tiny, despised creatures could transition from mere pests to unlikely participants in the strange, often desperate, world of 17th century medicine. Their omnipresence, combined with a medical framework that sought balance and expulsion, created a peculiar logic where the very things we now try so hard to eradicate were once seen as potential allies in the fight against illness. It's a truly humbling reminder of how far medical understanding has come, and how profoundly different the past truly was. Think about the gradual shift in language. While physicians would still speak of humors for a long time, you start to see more detailed descriptions of symptoms, more attempts at classifying diseases based on observable signs, rather than just abstract imbalances. It was a slow incremental change, like watching a glacier move, almost imperceptible day by day, but profoundly transformative over decades. Now, let's delve deeper into the twisted logic that transformed these common pests into potential medical marvels. You're observing a 17th century physician, perhaps a learned man poring over ancient texts, or a pragmatic folk healer with generations of observational knowledge. They're not thinking about germs or viruses, they're thinking about humors, about balance, and about the expulsion of harmful substances from the body. And in this framework, the humble louse, with its blood-sucking habits, began to be seen as a tool for extraction, a living miniature leech. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, skepticism, and scientific inquiry, further fueled this intellectual shift. Thinkers across Europe began to question long-held beliefs, demanding evidence and logical explanations. While medical advancements were slower than in other fields, this broader intellectual climate created an environment where new ideas, even those that directly contradicted centuries of tradition, could begin to take root. It's like trying to convince someone to switch from a flip phone to a smartphone. It takes time, and they might resist. But eventually, the benefits become undeniable. Imagine the prevailing medical understanding illness is often caused by an excess of a particular humor, or by some noxious substance, a poison or corruption, festering within the body. The goal of treatment, therefore, is to remove this harmful element. We've already discussed bloodletting, purging, and vomiting as methods of expulsion. But what if the problem was more localized, or subtle? What if the bad humors or corrupt matter were concentrated in a specific area, or were simply too diffuse for a full-body purge? This is where the theory of extraction and the role of lice comes into play. The increasing professionalization of medicine also played a role. While barber surgeons still existed, universities began to place a greater emphasis on anatomical knowledge and clinical observation. This slowly elevated the status of physicians who based their practice on empirical findings rather than solely on ancient texts. It was a long, arduous process, but the seeds of modern medicine were being sown. The common historical fact is that leeches were widely used in medicine during this period for bloodletting. Their ability to draw blood from the body was well understood and utilized. So it wasn't a huge leap of faith to consider other blood-sucking creatures in a similar light. If a leech could remove bad blood, why couldn't a louse, albeit on a much smaller scale, remove other harmful substances or humors? The logic, however flawed, followed a certain internal consistency within their medical paradigm. It's like believing that if a big vacuum cleaner can remove dirt, then a tiny handheld one can remove tiny bits of dust. The principle is the same, even if the effectiveness is questionable. So, as you settle deeper into your peaceful slumber, imagine the quiet hum of intellectual curiosity in the 17th century. It was a time when the world was still largely mysterious, and disease a terrifying enigma. Yet, within this uncertainty, brave minds began to look closer, to question old truths, and to seek new explanations. The invention of the microscope, the growing interest in anatomy, and the broader spirit of the Enlightenment all contributed to a slow but irreversible shift away from the bizarre remedies of the past, paving the way for a future where the true culprits of disease would finally be revealed. It's a testament to the enduring human drive to understand, to innovate, and to ultimately heal. The idea was that lice, by feeding on the blood and fluids of the host, were literally drawing out the illness. They were seen as miniature purifiers, sucking away the corrupt humors or the morbid matter that was causing the disease. If you had a fever, perhaps the lice were drawing out the excess heat or the inflamed blood. If you had a skin ailment, maybe they were extracting the toxins causing the irritation. It was a fascinating, if gross, application of their understanding of bodily fluids and disease. And so, we arrive at the final chapter of our journey, looking back at the echoes of a bygone era and marveling at the incredible distance humanity has traveled in its quest for health. You're now back in your own time, surrounded by the comforts and certainties of modern medicine, but with a newfound appreciation for the struggles and beliefs of those who came before. The 17th century, with its strange remedies and peculiar logic, might seem like a distant, almost alien world, but it was a crucial stepping stone in the relentless march of human understanding. Now, for a unique and lesser-known detail, some practitioners even believed that the lice would preferentially feed on the diseased blood or humors, actively seeking out the unhealthy parts of the body. This added a layer of almost intelligent design to their role, turning them from mere parasites into discerning medical assistants. It was as if these tiny creatures had an innate ability to diagnose and treat, guided by some unseen force to target the very essence of the illness. Imagine a tiny six-legged medical drone, programmed to find and remove your ailments. It's a truly bizarre thought, isn't it? Imagine comparing the sick room of the 17th century, dimly lit and filled with the scent of strange concoctions, to a modern hospital room. The contrast is stark. The common historical fact is that life expectancy in the 17th century was dramatically lower than today, often hovering around 35 to 40 years, with high infant mortality rates. Diseases that we now easily treat with antibiotics or vaccines, like measles, smallpox, or tuberculosis, were often death sentences. The fear of illness was pervasive, a constant shadow over daily life. This belief in preferential feeding also explained, in their minds, why lice might abandon a severely ill host. If the patient's humors became too corrupt or their body too cold, indicating a severe imbalance or decline, the lice, being discerning little creatures, would no longer find the environment hospitable or the food appealing, and thus would leave. This reinforced the idea that their presence was a sign of a body still fighting, still capable of sustaining life, even if that life included a thriving colony of parasites. Today, you benefit from centuries of accumulated knowledge, from the germ theory of disease to advanced surgical techniques and sophisticated pharmaceuticals. You understand that bacteria and viruses invisible to the naked eye are the true culprits behind many illnesses, not imbalances of humors or malevolent miasmas. You trust in sterile environments, in evidence-based medicine, and in the power of vaccines to protect you from diseases that once decimated populations? It's like upgrading from a horse-drawn carriage to a self-driving electric car. The fundamental purpose is the same, but the technology is light years apart. This leads us to a point of academic debate. Historians still debate the precise origin of this extraction theory as it applied to lice. Was it a direct extension of leech therapy, or did it arise independently from observations of lice on sick individuals? The lack of detailed, explicit medical treatises on this specific application makes it challenging to pinpoint its exact genesis, and how widely it was formally taught versus being a folk belief. The journey from believing lice could cure you to understanding DNA and developing gene therapies is a testament to the insatiable human curiosity and the power of scientific inquiry. It wasn't a straight line, but a winding path filled with missteps, dead ends, and brilliant breakthroughs. Each peculiar remedy, each flawed theory, was a piece of the puzzle, a step towards a more accurate understanding of the human body and the world around it. So you're sick, perhaps with a persistent fever that has drained your strength. The physician, after examining your humors, might suggest a course of treatment that, alongside herbs and perhaps a mild purge, includes encouraging the presence of lice. You might be advised not to comb your hair too vigorously, or to allow your clothing to remain unwashed for a time, to ensure these tiny healers could do their work. It sounds counterintuitive to us, but in their world, it was a logical extension of their medical principles. Now, for a unique and lesser-known detail, did you know that even as late as the 18th and early 19th centuries, some traditional medical practices, echoing the humoral theories of the 17th century, still persisted in certain rural or isolated communities? The transition from old to new was not instantaneous or uniform. Pockets of traditional beliefs, including some that might have involved the use of insects or other animal parts, lingered long after more scientific approaches gained traction in urban centers and academic institutions. It highlights the enduring power of folk medicine and the slow pace of knowledge dissemination. The psychological aspect of this is also worth considering. When you're ill and desperate, any potential remedy, no matter how unconventional, offers a glimmer of hope. The visible presence of lice and the constant itching might even have been interpreted as a sign that the treatment was actively working, that the bad humors were being drawn out. It's a grim comfort, but comfort nonetheless. This leads us to a point of academic debate. Historians still debate the precise cultural and social factors that allowed some of these seemingly irrational medical beliefs to persist for so long, even in the face of emerging scientific evidence. Was it simply inertia, a distrust of new ideas, or a pragmatic reliance on what was familiar and accessible? The answer likely involves a complex interplay of all these elements, demonstrating how deeply embedded medical practices are within broader societal structures. This theory of extraction wasn't limited to lice. Of course, other creatures and substances were also believed to draw out illness. Think of poultices made from various organic materials, applied to the skin to draw out inflammation or infection. The underlying principle was the same: remove the bad stuff, and the body will heal. Lice just happened to be a particularly convenient and readily available extracting agent in a world where they were already an unavoidable part of daily life. Think about the psychological shift. From a world where illness was often seen as a punishment from God, or a mystical imbalance, to a world where it's understood as a biological process that can be studied, diagnosed, and treated with precision. This shift has not only extended human lifespans, but also fundamentally changed our relationship with our own bodies and the concept of health itself. You no longer live in constant fear of unseen forces. You live with the knowledge that many ailments can be prevented or cured. It's important to remember that this wasn't a malicious practice. These were people genuinely trying to alleviate suffering and cure disease with the best knowledge and tools available to them. Their understanding of the human body and disease was simply fundamentally different from ours. They were working with the information they had, making logical deductions within their own scientific framework. It's easy for us to scoff from our vantage point of modern medicine, but for them, it was cutting edge, or at least widely accepted practice. The story of 17th century medicine, while with its reliance on humors and its peculiar fascination with lice as a cure, is not just a historical curiosity. It's a powerful reminder of the human condition, our vulnerability to disease, our desperate search for relief, and our remarkable capacity to learn and adapt. It shows us that even in the darkest corners of ignorance, there was a genuine desire to heal, a profound human instinct to alleviate suffering. So, as you slowly drift into a deeper state of relaxation, envision the tiny, almost imperceptible movements of these creatures, not as a source of discomfort, but as a silent, diligent effort to restore balance. In the 17th century, the humble louse was not just a pest, it was a participant in the grand drama of health and illness, a tiny, blood-sucking agent of extraction, working tirelessly, albeit unknowingly, to draw out the very essence of disease. It's a testament to the ingenuity, and sometimes the sheer desperation, of a bygone era, where even the most unwelcome guests found a surprising role in the quest for well-being. And as you reflect on this journey, remember that the pursuit of knowledge is never truly finished. Just as the 17th century thinkers began to chip away at ancient beliefs, so too do we continue to refine our understanding of health and disease. What seems cutting edge today might be a quaint historical footnote centuries from now. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? Now, with the theory of extraction firmly in mind, let's explore the specific ailments for which these tiny, blood-sucking healers were prescribed. You're stepping into the sick room of the 17th century, a place often dimly lit, perhaps with the scent of sickness mingling with attempts at masking it with herbs. The patient lies restless, their body racked with fever, or perhaps their mind clouded by a mysterious affliction. In this vulnerable state, the physician, or the local wise woman, would turn to a variety of remedies, and sometimes those remedies included the very creatures we've been discussing. So, as the last whispers of the 17th century fade into the quiet of your room, and you settle into a deep, restorative sleep, carry with you the echoes of a time when the world was both terrifying and wondrous, and where even the smallest, most despised creatures held a surprising place in the human story of healing. Now, Wax, as our journey through the 17th century comes to a close, let us look back at the echoes of a bygone era and marvel at the incredible distance humanity has traveled in its quest for health. You are returning to your own time, surrounded by the comforts and certainties of modern medicine, but with a new appreciation for the struggles and beliefs of those who came before. The 17th century, with its strange remedies and peculiar logic, may seem like a distant, almost alien world, but it was a crucial stepping stone in the relentless advance of human understanding. Imagine a common scenario, a persistent fever. This was a terrifying symptom in the 17th century, as fevers often indicated serious, life-threatening illnesses like typhus, malaria, or smallpox. Within the humoral framework, a fever was typically seen as an excess of hot and wet humors, particularly blood. The body was overheating, and this heat was believed to be causing the corruption of the humors. The common historical fact is that bloodletting was the primary treatment for fevers, aimed at reducing the plethora of blood and cooling the body. But what if bloodletting wasn't enough? Or if the patient was too weak for such a drastic measure? Imagine the difference between a 17th century sick room, dimly lit and filled with the smell of strange concoctions, and a modern hospital room. The contrast is stark. It is a well-known historical fact that life expectancy in the 17th century was significantly lower than it is today, often only 35 to 40 years old, with high infant mortality rates. Diseases that we can now easily treat with antibiotics or vaccines, such as measles, smallpox, or tuberculosis, were often death sentences. The fear of disease was overwhelming, a constant shadow over everyday life. This is where the lice, in their role as miniature leeches, might come into play. The idea was that by drawing off small amounts of blood, they could help to reduce the fever and extract the corrupt or inflamed humors. It was a gentler but more continuous form of bloodletting, a subtle draining that they hoped it would gradually restore balance without the shock of a major vein opening. You might be advised to leave your hair and body uncombed, allowing the lice to thrive. Their constant feeding seen as a therapeutic process. It's like trying to fix an overflowing bathtub with a tiny sponge, rather than pulling the plug, a slow, methodical, and ultimately ineffective approach, but one that made sense in their limited understanding. Today, you benefit from centuries of accumulated knowledge, from germ theory to advanced surgical techniques and sophisticated pharmaceuticals. You understand that bacteria and viruses, invisible to the naked eye, are the real culprits behind many illnesses, not imbalances of humors or harmful gases. You trust in sterile environments, in evidence-based medicine, and in the power of vaccines to protect you from diseases that once ravaged populations. It's like upgrading from horse-drawn carriages to self-driving electric cars. The basic purpose is the same: but the technology is light years apart. But fevers weren't the only target. Consider skin ailments, rashes, boils, ulcers, or other mysterious eruptions. These were often attributed to bad humors trying to escape the body, or to toxins festering beneath the skin. In such cases, the lice were believed to draw out these localized impurities. By feeding on the affected areas, they were thought to literally suck out the morbid matter, cleansing the skin and promoting healing. It was a kind of micro-drainage, a continuous poultice that worked from within. You might even be encouraged to apply a cloth infested with lice directly to a troubled area, a truly unique and lesser-known detail of their medical practices. Imagine a doctor prescribing a louse patch for your eczema. It's enough to make your skin crawl, isn't it? The journey from believing that lice could cure disease to understanding DNA and developing gene therapy is a testament to the relentless curiosity of humans and the power of scientific research. It was not a straight line, but a winding path filled with mistakes, dead ends, and brilliant breakthroughs. Each strange remedy, each erroneous theory, was a piece of the puzzle, a step toward a more accurate understanding of the human body and the world around us. This belief in the efficacy of lice extended to even more mysterious and debilitating conditions. For instance, some accounts suggest they were used for conditions involving the head, such as headaches, migraines, or even what they might have called melancholy or frenzy, conditions that we would now attribute to neurological or psychological imbalances. The theory here was that the lice, by drawing blood from the scalp, could relieve pressure in the head or extract vapors or bad humors that were clouding the mind. It was a desperate attempt to alleviate symptoms they couldn't understand. A shot in the dark with the most readily available tool? Now, a unique and little-known detail. Did you know that even in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, some traditional medical practices, echoing the humoral theories of the 17th century, persisted in some rural or isolated communities? The transition from old to new was not immediate or uniform. These pockets of traditional beliefs, including some that may involve the use of insects or other animal parts, persisted long after more scientific methods were adopted in urban centers and academic institutions. It highlights the enduring power of folk medicine and the slow pace at which knowledge spread. For children, who were particularly susceptible to various illnesses and often had abundant head lice, these tiny creatures were sometimes seen as a natural, even protective, element. If a child was sickly, but still had a healthy population of lice, it might be interpreted as a sign that their body was still fighting, still capable of sustaining life. Conversely, if a child suddenly became free of lice during an illness, it was a cause for alarm, a sign that their vital humors were dwindling, and the healthy environment for the lice was disappearing. This reinforces the earlier idea that the departure of lice was more concerning than their presence. It's like noticing your houseplants dying and thinking it's a sign of your own declining health, rather than realizing you just forgot to water them. Which brings us to a point of scholarly debate. Historians still debate the exact cultural and social factors that allowed some of these seemingly irrational medical beliefs to persist for so long, even in the face of emerging scientific evidence. Was it simply stagnation, a distrust of new ideas, or a pragmatic reliance on what was familiar and accessible? The answer may lie in the complex interplay of all these factors, showing how deeply medical practices were embedded in broader social structures. This leads us to a point of academic debate. Historians still debate the true prevalence and formal endorsement of lice as a medical treatment. While anecdotal evidence and mentions in some historical medical texts exist, it's unclear how widely this was a standard physician-prescribed remedy versus a folk practice passed down through generations, particularly among the lower classes who had limited access to formal medical care. The line between superstition and accepted medical practice was often blurred in the 17th century. Think of psychological change from a world where disease was often seen as a punishment from God or a mystical imbalance, to one where it is understood as a biological process that can be accurately studied, diagnosed, and treated. This shift not only extends human lifespans, but also fundamentally changes our relationship with our bodies and the concept of health. You no longer live in constant fear of unseen forces. You live with the knowledge that many diseases can be prevented or cured. The story of 17th century medicine, with its reliance on humors and its strange fascination with lice as a cure, is more than just a historical curiosity. It is a powerful reminder of the human condition, our vulnerability to disease, our desperate search for relief, and our astonishing capacity to learn and adapt. It shows us that even in the darkest corners of ignorance, there is a heartfelt desire to heal, a deep human instinct to alleviate suffering. The logic, however peculiar, was consistent with the broader humoral theory. If disease was an internal imbalance, then encouraging a creature that visibly extracted bodily fluids seemed like a reasonable, if unconventional, approach to restoring that balance. It was a pragmatic solution born out of desperation and a lack of scientific understanding. They didn't have antibiotics, antiseptics, or even a basic grasp of microbiology. They were working with what they had, and what they had in abundance were lice. So, as the last whispers of the 17th century fade into the silence of your room, and you drift off into a deep sleep, take with you the echoes of an age both terrifying and wondrous, and where even the smallest, most despised creatures held a surprising place in the story of human healing. It's easy for us to recoil at the thought, but put yourself in their shoes. You're watching a loved one suffer, perhaps dying slowly from a fever or a wasting disease. The established remedies aren't working. A physician, or a respected elder, suggests that allowing the lice to remain, or even encouraging their presence, might help draw out the illness. In a world where death was a constant companion and medical options were few and far between, you might be willing to try almost anything. The potential for relief, however slim, would outweigh the inherent disgust. Moreover, the lack of immediate visible harm from lice bites beyond the itching likely made them seem less dangerous than, say, a drastic bloodletting that could leave a patient severely weakened. They were a known quantity, a familiar nuisance, now reinterpreted as a potential ally. It's a fascinating example of how cultural context and prevailing scientific paradigms can shape perceptions of something as seemingly straightforward as a parasitic insect. This humoral theory wasn't just about diagnosis, it dictated treatment. If you had too much of a humor, the logical step was to remove it. If you had too little, you tried to increase it. This led to some truly fascinating and often horrifying medical interventions. Bloodletting, for instance, was a common historical fact. If you had a fever, a headache, or almost any inflammatory condition, the first recourse was often to open a vein and drain some blood. The belief was that the excess blood was causing the heat and pressure, and removing it would restore balance. You'd see barber surgeons with their striped poles representing blood and bandages, performing this procedure with alarming frequency, often with little regard for sterility or the patient's overall weakened state. It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet by draining the entire water tank. Technically, the leak stops, but at what cost?